A 57-ton tank should not lose a fight to a 15-pound steel tube. On paper, the math wasn't close. The Tiger one carried an 88mm gun that could kill a Sherman before the Sherman's crew ever spotted the muzzle flash. Its front armour ran up to 120mm around the mantlet, thick enough to shrug off almost everything the Allies had in 1943. The American bazooka, by comparison, was a length of pipe with a battery clip, firing a rocket that most infantrymen had barely been trained to use. So how does a weapon that couldn't reliably punch through the front of that tank end up stopping one cleanly in the time it takes to read this sentence? Not because the physics changed, because somebody stopped aiming at the tank the enemy wanted them to aim at. Picture this first. An Italian field, 1944, 57 tons of German steel rolling straight at a man crouched in a ditch with a steel tube on his shoulder. He doesn't aim at the front. He's already given up on that shot. He aims at the track. One rocket. The tank lurches, groans, and stops for good. 30 seconds later, its crew is dead, and the two Tigers behind it have already turned around and driven away. That happened. This is how. The Americans met the Tiger one for the first time in Sicily in July 1943, and it did not go the way anyone hoped. German paratroop armour units of the Hermann Göring Division rolled Tigers toward the beaches at Gela on the second day of the invasion, and the weapon that eventually stopped them wasn't the bazooka. It was naval gunfire from the cruiser USS Boise and the destroyer USS Shubrick, plus a scrappy fight from paratrooper howitzer crews, and 57mm anti-tank guns rushed up from the beachhead. One of the Tigers lost that week was finished off by a paratrooper artillery crew firing point-blank in the face of return fire from the tank's own gun. A second, abandoned Tiger near the road to Nishemi was destroyed by a lieutenant who simply walked up to its crew, who had climbed out to check a map and dropped a grenade among them. The bazooka existed by then. It just wasn't doing much. American troops had received the weapon only months earlier, and the version fielded in North Africa, the original M1, had a habit of embarrassing its operators. Rockets prone to sticking in the tube, warheads that underperformed, crews who'd had almost no live fire instruction before being handed the thing and told to go stop a Panzer. Eisenhower himself noted how poorly trained the first bazooka gunners in Operation Torch had been. The improved M1A1 arrived in mid-1943 with a better rocket and a simplified firing system. But by Sicily, most infantrymen still treated the bazooka the way a rookie treats a shotgun. He's fired exactly once, useful in theory, terrifying in practice, and not something you'd bet your life on against 100mm of German steel. That hesitation made sense, because on the numbers, betting your life on it was close to suicidal, and the men who eventually made the trick work weren't relying on the numbers at all. They were relying on something the Allies had only just started to learn. 3 months before Sicily, in Tunisia, a small mistake gave the Allies something no amount of guesswork could have provided: an intact Tiger. On April 24, 1943, on a hill the British called Point 174, a Tiger I duelled a squadron of Churchill tanks armed with nothing bigger than a 6-pounder gun, a weapon that by every reasonable estimate had no business troubling a Tiger's front armour. It didn't need to. One shot skimmed the underside of the Tiger's own 88mm barrel, ricocheted downward, and lodged in the seam of the turret ring. The impact jammed the turret solid, tore open a weld, and wrecked the radio. A second round struck a lifting lug and disabled the gun's elevation gear. A third smashed through an open loader's hatch the crew had left ajar because of the heat. None of the 3 rounds came close to defeating the Tiger's armour in the way anyone expected armour to be defeated. They found the machine's joints instead, and the crew, unable to fight or communicate, abandoned a tank that was otherwise almost undamaged, and failed, crucially, to set off the self-destruct charge that would have turned their mistake into scrap metal. That tank became Tiger 131, shipped to England and torn apart piece by piece at the School of Tank Technology. Its capture was treated as important enough that Winston Churchill and King George VI both travelled to be photographed beside it. And the report that came out of that teardown, where the plates overlapped, where the welds sat, where a turret ring could jam, where a hatch hinge could fail, fed directly into the tactical literature that both British and American units used to brief their infantry on how the Tiger actually worked, not how it looked from the outside. Here's the twist historians only sorted out decades later. For almost 70 years, even the Tank Museum told the story wrong, crediting the capture to a different engagement at a hillside 15 miles away, based on one veteran's honest but mistaken memory. It took an amateur researcher digging through his own father's account of that same Sherwood Foresters attack to correct the record in 2019. The single intelligence coup that helped teach the Allies where a Tiger could actually be hurt had its own location misfiled for most of its documented history. So if the intelligence that cracked the Tiger's mystique came from a lucky ricochet and a jammed hatch, not a design flaw anyone had planned for, what did that mean for the infantrymen who couldn't count on luck and had to make the same kind of hit happen on purpose? Here is what a bazooka gunner was actually up against once the guesswork gave way to hard numbers. The Tiger I's hull front ran 100 to 102 millimeters of hardened steel, angled just enough to add effective thickness. The turret front and gun mantelet were worse, 100 millimeters on the turret itself and up to 200 millimeters where the mantelet overlapped the turret face, functioning almost like spaced armor. The M6 rocket fired by the original bazooka could punch through roughly 76 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor at best. Even the improved M6A3 round, fielded from later 1943 onward, topped out around 100 millimeters under ideal conditions, a straight perpendicular hit at close range on flat plate. Against the Tiger's front, that was a coin flip on a good day and a wasted rocket on a bad one. Compare that to the tank's own weapon. The Tiger's 8.8 centimeter WK-36 could put a round through over 100 millimeters of armor from more than a kilometer out, well before a Sherman crew could return effective fire, let alone before a two-man bazooka team crouched in a ditch could line up a shot. If a team tried to engage a Tiger head-on in open ground, the tank would see them traverse and fire long before the men were close enough to do anything but die for nothing. So the frontal engagement, the one every training poster seemed to imply, soldier kneels, tank charges, soldier fires, tank explodes, was close to a fantasy. Against the Tiger's front and gun mantelet, a bazooka rocket was, more often than not, just a very loud way to announce your position to 88 tons of angry German engineering. Which raises the obvious question nobody wanted to say out loud in 1943. If the front was effectively a brick wall, was the bazooka simply useless against the best tank in the war? Or was everyone just aiming at the wrong tank? The Tiger's weak point wasn't a hidden flaw. It was a trade-off, and every heavy tank in the war made the same one. Armor is heavy, and a tank can't carry maximum thickness on every surface without becoming too slow to fight. So designers spent their steel where the enemy was expected to shoot from, dead ahead, and economized everywhere else. The Tiger's side hole dropped to somewhere between 60 and 82 millimeters depending on which panel you hit, still respectable, but suddenly within a bazooka's reach at close range and a favorable angle. The rear, protecting the engine deck and radiators, was thinner still, and underneath all of that armor debate sat something no designer could thicken away: the running gear. The drive sprocket, the idler wheel, the interleaved road wheels, the track itself, components that had to flex, rotate and absorb shock, which meant they could never be armoured like a glacis plate, no matter how badly the engineers wanted to. A Soviet anti-tank manual circulating among crews facing the same tank on the Eastern Front spelled the logic out in blunt terms. Aim for the drive sprocket, the idler, or the track, because that's what makes the tank move, and a tank that can't move is a tank that can't fight the way it was built to fight. A stationary Tiger was still an 88mm gun on a turret, but it was no longer a mobile threat that could reposition, flank, or run. It became a fixed point, and fixed points can be surrounded, isolated, and finished. That single reframing is the whole trick. American infantry manuals and unit-level tactical lessons push the same idea from the other direction. Don't try to kill the tank, disable it. Blow off a track, jam a sprocket, wreck a road wheel, and you've converted an unstoppable armoured threat into an immobile pillbox with a crew who now has to make an impossible decision. Sit inside a target that can no longer move, or climb out into rifle range and hope. Months later, in an Italian field, one sergeant would take that exact idea and compress it into a single rocket and 30 seconds. But first, the men figuring this out in 1943 had to survive close enough to try it, which begs a question every gunner had to answer in the 2 or 3 seconds after his rocket connected. What happens to the men inside when the machine that made them feel invincible suddenly can't move at all? This is why so many of the Bazooka's genuine successes against Tigers didn't happen in open country. They happened in towns, in hedgerow lanes, along sunken roads, anywhere a tank's mobility was already constrained and its crew's visibility was already reduced. In those conditions, a two-man team could let a Tiger crawl past a wall or a hedge at 15, 20, 30 yards, well inside the range where even a marginal rocket could bite into thinner side or rear plating. Range barely mattered to the shaped charge warhead itself. A heat round performs almost identically whether fired from 10 yards or 300, since it doesn't rely on velocity to punch through steel. What mattered was angle and target. Close range simply made it possible to guarantee both, because the gunner could see exactly where the armour thinned out and put the rocket there instead of hoping. Bazooka doctrine that filtered down through infantry units by 1944 reflected this directly. Go for the side, go for the rear, go for the tracks, and if none of those are available, don't bother with the front at all. Some crews aimed specifically for the engine deck grills at the rear, where a rocket that didn't fully penetrate could still ignite fuel vapour or damage the Maybach 512 that powered the thing. Others went for the joint where turret met hull, or the thinner cupola on top, spots that had nothing to do with brute penetration and everything to do with finding the one seam in an otherwise closed fist. It's worth noticing how closely that instinct mirrors what those 3 lucky British shots found by accident on point 174. Not the armour itself, but its joints. None of this made the bazooka a reliable tank killer. It made it a situational one, a weapon that turned deadly only when the terrain, the angle and the range lined up and remained mostly useless everywhere else. Here's a detail the American training films never mentioned, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. The Germans didn't just fear the bazooka, they studied it. Early bazookas fell into German hands during the fighting in North Africa, and more arrived via captured Soviet stocks after the weapon reached the Eastern Front through Lend-Lease. German engineers liked what they saw enough to build their own heavier version, the Raketenpanzerbuchse, nicknamed the Panzerschreck, fielded from 1943 onward with an 88mm warhead, nearly twice the diameter of the American original. By late 1944, Panzerschreck teams were doing to American Shermans exactly what bazooka teams did to Tigers. During the Battle of the Bulge, German infantry used the weapon to pick off American armour moving through the same kind of hedged, narrow terrain that had sheltered bazooka teams a year earlier. Same doctrine, same terrain, same 75-yard math, just pointed the other direction. So the weapon built to give an American infantryman a fighting chance against a panzer ended up handing German infantrymen a devastating tool of their own, used against the very Shermans and half-tracks the bazooka was supposed to protect. It's the kind of detail that doesn't fit neatly into a hero's journey narrative, and maybe that's exactly why it matters. The trick that let a bazooka team beat a Tiger wasn't unique to Americans at all. It was available to anyone patient enough to get close and aim at the joints instead of the plate. The only question was who was willing to pay the price of getting close enough to use it. Because here's the part the training films left out entirely. Getting inside 20 or 30 yards of a Tiger, close enough to guarantee a side or rear shot, meant standing somewhere that tanks' own machine guns could reach, and often somewhere its escort infantry could reach too. A bazooka backblast was violently visible, a plume of flame and smoke behind the gunner that told everyone nearby exactly where he was kneeling. There was no second chance built into the weapon. Reloading took several seconds. A loader had to survive standing upright, in the open, next to a man who'd just announced their position to an 88-ton armoured vehicle and everyone riding alongside it. Crews who used the trick well didn't just understand geometry. They understood exposure and they accepted it as the price of the shot, which is part of why the men who pulled it off tended to become legends rather than statistics, and why the two clearest examples of the trick working came from soldiers who, on paper, had already run out of reasons to keep fighting that day. Technical Sergeant Van T. Barfoot of the 45th Infantry Division was already having an extraordinary day before the tanks showed up. Near the town of Carano, Italy, during the breakout push from Anzio, he had crossed a minefield alone, knocked out 2 machine gun nests, one with a grenade, one at the muzzle of his Thompson, and taken a string of prisoners along the German line. By the time his platoon reorganized, he'd accounted for roughly 24 enemy soldiers killed or captured without anyone else firing a shot on his flank. Then the Germans answered the only way that made sense against a stalled infantry advance. They sent 3 Tiger I tanks forward in a counterattack. Barfoot didn't retreat, and he didn't wait for armour support that wasn't coming. He grabbed a bazooka and moved into a position roughly 75 yards out, directly along the tank's expected line of advance, close enough that hitting the wrong spot wasn't really an option anymore. When the lead Tiger came into range, he didn't aim for the glasses plate or the mantelet. He put the rocket into the track. The tank stopped where it stood, its momentum converted instantly into a fixed, disabled target. As the crew realized what had happened and began climbing out, Barfoot was already moving, and he cut them down with his Thompson before they reached cover. The other 2 Tigers, watching their lead vehicle die in the space of a single engagement, changed course and pulled back rather than press the attack. 1 rocket, 1 track, 1 tank permanently out of the fight, and 2 more that decided the math wasn't in their favour either. Barfoot spent the rest of that day dismantling an abandoned German artillery piece and dragging 2 wounded Americans back to their own lines. He received the Medal of Honor for the full sequence of actions that day, presented to him that September in Epinal, France. But the tank engagement is the piece that keeps getting retold, because it's such a clean demonstration of the trick working exactly as intended. Not armour penetration. Immobilization, followed by a window of seconds in which a crew that had spent the war inside 60 tons of steel found itself standing in the open with nothing between it and a submachine gun. What's striking is how little of that outcome depended on the bazooka being a good weapon. It depended on Barfoot refusing to fight the tank on the terms the tank was built for. Barfoot's engagement is the textbook version of the trick. Clean, decisive, over in seconds. But the story of PFRFC George Burns of the 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves, fighting in a European town later in the war, shows how ragged the real thing usually looked. A German tank had parked itself in a village square, firing point blank into buildings where the remnants of Burns's platoon were sheltering. He wanted to move against it, but discovered his own unit was out of bazookas and ammunition entirely. The weapon that was supposed to solve this exact problem simply wasn't there anymore. So Burns went looking for one somewhere else. He found an American tank destroyer sitting buttoned up nearby, its crew refusing to leave the safety of their own armour to help, and did the only thing left to do. He pulled a bazooka and rounds directly off the side of their vehicle and went back to confront the tank himself. It's an uncomfortable detail for a war hero story. The men who should have been the obvious solution stayed sealed inside their own steel, while an infantryman scavenged their weapon and did the job on foot. But it underlines something the tactical manuals never quite capture. The trick wasn't just a targeting solution, it required someone willing to go get the weapon, position it, and use it, even when everyone with a safer option chose not to. For his actions that day, Burns was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the highest decorations in the US Army, just below the Medal of Honor. The trick didn't retire with the Tiger I. In January 1945, during the failed German offensive Operation Nordwind, a platoon of Jagdtigers, turretless tank destroyers built on a stretched Tiger II chassis, mounting a 128mm gun and carrying the thickest armour of any armoured vehicle fielded in the war, rolled into position near the French town of Rimling. One of them, numbered 134, was providing overwatch from a slope when it was struck in its side armour. Some accounts credit an M36 tank destroyer, others credit a Bazooka team, and the record still isn't fully settled on which one landed the fatal hit. What isn't disputed is that the vehicle's ammunition detonated, killing the crew, and that the other two Jagdtigers in the group immediately withdrew rather than risk the same fate. If the bazooka really was the weapon responsible, it means the exact same logic that worked against a 57-ton tank in an Italian field in 1944 also worked, at least once, against a 72-ton monster its own designers considered nearly invulnerable. Not because the tube got stronger, because the side armour of even Germany's heaviest fighting vehicle was still thinner than its front, and somebody was still willing to get close enough to find that seam. So which is it? A bazooka team repeating a trick that had already worked a dozen times over, or a tank destroyer crew getting credit history hasn't fully sorted out? Almost 80 years later, that particular question is still open. The Tiger I was pulled from production by the end of 1944, replaced on paper by tanks meant to fix its every flaw. The flaw that actually mattered, the one that let a two-man team with a 15-pound tube turn a 57-ton nightmare into a stationary target, was never really fixed at all. It was just armour spent according to a designer's best guess about where the enemy would aim. The trick was aiming somewhere else. The only thing that ever stood between that idea and a dead crew was how close a man was willing to get to find out if it worked.